Now, historically, one of the most popular topics on my channel is how do you make money in old school RuneScape? I've made dozens, if not hundreds of videos on the topic, but one video I've never made to accompany it is how do you spend money in old school? I know, it sounds like it's pretty easy to spend money. There are countless different ways to spend money and go broke again, but what I'm talking about is what are some efficient things you should be using your money on starting right from a new account, moving into the mid game, into the late game. Now, especially in the early game, in my opinion, there's actually not as much to spend your money on as you would think. Sure, having tons of money does help, but you really don't need a significant amount until you get much deeper into the game. Now, if we start on a fresh main account, what would I prioritize spending the limited money you're gonna get on? Well, the first thing would be to try to get 50 magic. Magic is one of the most powerful ways to progress your account in the early game. It offers so many different upgrades, from being a pretty strong combat skill right at the beginning, to offering dozens of different teleports around the map. The higher you can get your magic level right away, the most time you're going to save by unlocking all of the basic teleports, and of course unlocking the Iban's Staff, which is probably the most powerful weapon you can get in the early game. 50 magic really will not cost you very much, and you can easily do it for under 200k, either by simply using Fire Strike, enchanting jewelry, or enchanting bolts. There are quite a few different ways to do it, but it should be a very cheap and lucrative upgrade. Now from here, another staple upgrade that you're going to want for the early and mid game is something that's a little expensive, but that would be 43 prayer. There's not really any cheaper way around this. It's simply going to cost you about 500,000 GP to get 43 prayer. You can do it a bit cheaper, but with Dragon Bones, it's going to cost about that much. It'll only take you about half an hour at a Gilded Altar to get this, but Protect from Magic, Melee, and Ranged are essential for questing, bossing, and any PVM encounter for the rest of the game. So the earlier you can get this, the wider the map will open up for you. So it's really quite an essential upgrade early. Now next up here we have kind of more of a general category, but that would be get yourself an early game gear set for each combat style. So that would be something like getting full rune and a dragon scimitar, an amulet of glory, a combat bracelet, dragon hide armor, and a ranged weapon, something like a rune crossbow or a magic shortbow. And for magic, that could be something like get yourself an Iban's Staff, or maybe full mystic. But in the end, you'll really only need to spend about a mil on early game gear to get yourself a very practical and usable set for all your early game questing, and maybe if you're feeling a little spicy, even an early game boss. So next up, another somewhat large investment, at least for the early game, could be into construction, and that would be mainly for 50 construction. Now 50 construction gives you a couple really helpful upgrades. Primarily, it'll let you build a portal chamber, which will allow you to put portals to a bunch of different locations in your house. This becomes particularly useful once you have a bit higher of a magic level and you've unlocked some of the other spell books, but still very helpful even right away. On top of that, it'll also unlock the Mounted Glory, which will make it so you can use the Glory teleports without having to recharge Amulets of Glory all the time. This is also just a nice base to work off of, as eventually you're going to need to get your construction much higher to unlock some of the most powerful upgrades, so it's not a bad idea to get started early. To get 50 construction, that's going to cost you about 750,000 GP, but in my opinion is more than worth it. Now one thing that players will often put too high a focus in is gear upgrades, and obviously upgrading your gear is very important, but especially in the early to mid game, leveling up your combat stats will give you a much bigger return on your investment than upgrading the odd piece of gear here and there. So that's why I'd recommend before you start upgrading your gear, like before you start buying a Amulet of Fury, a Berserker Ring, any of those kind of mid game quintessential upgrades, I would highly recommend making sure you train up your combat stats first. Now training melee doesn't tend to cost any money, but ranged and magic do, and that's why at this point I would shoot to get 75 ranged or 75 magic, or ideally both. Now ranged and magic can be leveled up for free, but it will take quite a bit longer. If you invest around 3 or 4 mil into either of them though, it'll speed up the process tremendously. But I will say this, you are going to be much better off spending 3 mil on 75 ranged than you would be buying an archer ring, at this point anyway. Weapon-wise, you'll now have access to the Trident of the Seas, the Toxic Blowpipe, multiple new teleports, and your combat stats will now be strong enough to take on some mid-game bosses. Now once you have that training under your belt, now is when I'd maybe start to focus on upgrading some of your gear. Like I said, the Toxic Blowpipe and the Trident of the Seas are massive upgrades at this point, but also upgrading to an Abyssal Whip is very strong. At this point, getting the Amulet of Fury is a decent upgrade, and of course getting your Dagonoth rings and imbuing them to start to become very viable upgrades. Also, you may want to consider getting Dragon Boots, and Occult Necklace is extremely powerful once you get 70 magic. There are a lot of things to start working on here, and at this point you might need to spend about 15 million GP to get most of these staple upgrades at this level. But for the love of God, don't buy anything expensive yet like Bandos, Armadillo. There are still much better things to spend your money on. So now that we are solidly in the mid-game, what should you look to do next? In my opinion, the next best thing is to invest money into a Questscape. The buyable skills required for a Questscape really aren't actually that expensive, and the highest requirement for any skill is usually only 70 at the most. The Questscape will unlock a huge amount of content in the game, some of the best bosses, convenient teleports, quality of life, new armor and weapons. It's just vital to progress in the game. Now, how much would it cost to get all of these skill requirements for a Questscape? Well, somewhere between 15 and 25 mil by my estimation, plus you'll need some gear and items to kill all the bosses and complete all the quests. But overall, this is probably the best investment for your GP, but of course it is a long process, but one very much worth doing. Now next up here, another decent investment is simply to get 70 prayer. This will allow you to use piety, which you can unlock for free, which is the strongest combat prayer in the game and will increase your damage a tremendous amount. Not much to say here, it is just one of the most strongest upgrades in the game and is really not that expensive. It'll only be about 4 or 5 mil to do it. Now from here, there's obviously tons of different things you can do, but one somewhat underrated upgrade, well maybe it's not underrated, but one that I would recommend doing sooner than you might anticipate is getting 83 construction. 83 construction will essentially allow you to, with a boost, max out your player-owned house. This will get you the highest level restoration pool, the highest level jewelry box, a fairy ring in your POH, a spirit tree, and anything else you might want. This is such a significant time save for so many different things. It's definitely worth getting sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, it is a fairly large investment of around 20 mil to get 83 construction, but it is definitely worth doing if you have the funds, and in my opinion this is definitely worth getting before any of the more expensive gear upgrades. Now at this point we need to start thinking about late game gear. Now this is where things start to get really expensive, so what you really want to prioritize upgrading is jewelry and weapons, and these are specifically going to be jewelry or weapons for content that you are going to want to do and will hopefully earn you some money back. So for example, if you want to do Zulrah, you might want to upgrade to a Toxic Trident, maybe buy a Ring of Suffering. If you have unlocked Vorkath and you want to do that, you might want to focus on either ranged or melee and try to afford a Dragon Hunter weapon. Getting your Zenyte pieces and the weapon of choice is going to give you the most bang for your buck as far as DPS, because things get expensive and you certainly won't be able to afford all of it all at once. Now from here, if you're going to be using ranged, I would highly recommend buying a Dexterous Prayer Scroll. They have unfortunately got a lot more expensive recently, and they cost about 30 to 35 mil, but unlocking Rigor is such a massive upgrade, especially if you're looking to get 99 ranged, do raids, do bosses. Assuming you have a decent weapon and your Zenyte pieces already, Rigor is going to probably be your next biggest upgrade. You could also consider getting Augury as well because it's a lot cheaper, but it isn't used nearly as much. So is this the time where I finally recommend getting those later game armor pieces, getting Bandos or Ancestral or Armadillo? Well, no, still don't do it. At this point, you are much better off simply investing all of your money into maxing out your combat stats. Getting 99 ranged and 99 magic and melee, of course, will be a much bigger upgrade than pretty much any gear upgrade at this level. So for range, going all the way to 99 will cost around 45 to 60 mil if you're using red Chinchompas, and really the only gear you really need beyond your basic mid-game gear is a Necklace of Anguish, which is the Zenyte piece, which hopefully you would already have by now. Now getting 99 magic is a bit cheaper, but if you do it similar to ranged by ice bursting or barraging in the Monkey Madness 2 tunnel, it will cost you around 30 or 35 mil, and the gear required really not that much. You're pretty well off with your mid-game gear, your occult, your Zenyte piece again ideally, and if you do happen to have enough money, you could consider buying a Nightmare Staff, but it's not strictly required. It will just save you a bit of money in the long run. But 99 magic should cost you around 30 to 35 mil, which is going to be a much bigger upgrade than simply buying, you know, one ancestral piece, not even. So yeah, definitely at this point, highly recommend maxing out your combats, minus prayer maybe, before you buy any other gear. Now of course at this point, the world's kind of your oyster. There's so much gear to spend your money on. Getting the best gear in the game at this point will cost billions, not millions. And really it'll depend on what you want to do, what bosses, what content is on the horizon before you actually purchase it. But in my opinion, I think this is a fairly efficient route on how to spend your money, starting in the early game all the way to the mid to late game. Anyway guys, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Now before I go here, I want to give a giant thank you to all of my members over on YouTube. Thank you to Mitch Reinders, March3258, Prophet of the Boosh, The Hybrid, and Kush Patel for subscribing at the Dragon tier. Thank you once again for all the support. Also thank you to YoYoStup89, Mexos, and NDM001 for subscribing at the Runite tier. Appreciate you all, and of course everyone else who became a member, subscribed, or just watched my video. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.